The crystal spires of New Valoria gleamed under the pale light of 3 moons as Administrator Veltar Moonweaver watched the sky with growing fear. Dark shapes moved between the stars like hungry predators circling wounded prey. The Ravager. Fleet had found them. Veltar's crystalline hands trembled as he activated the emergency broadcast system. His people were artists and scientists who had spent generations building this peaceful colony on the edge of known space. They had no weapons beyond simple mining tools and no soldiers beyond security guards trained to handle minor disputes. Now death approached from the void in ships designed for one purpose: destruction. The first attack came without warning. Red beams of energy lanced down from orbit and turned the northern research station into molten glass. Screams echoed through the communication channels as Valorians ran for shelter that would not protect them. The colony's shields flickered and died under the sustained bombardment. Their defensive satellites lasted mere seconds against weapons. Built by a species that knew only war, Veltar opened the emergency protocols and began transmitting on all frequencies. His melodic voice carried across space in the ancient Valorian language of distress. He spoke of his people's peaceful ways and begged for any civilized species to hear their plea. But deep in his heart, he knew the truth. They were too far from the core worlds. No help would come in time. The Ravager ships descended like falling stars. Veltar could see them now through the observation dome of the command center. Black hulls covered in weapon ports and armor plating. Ships built by a race that conquered worlds for sport and enslaved entire species for entertainment. The Valorians had heard whispers of the Ravagers in the outer colonies, but had never believed such monsters truly existed. Communications Officer Rindal approached with tears streaming down her crystal face. She had been monitoring the emergency, channels for any response to their distress call. The news was worse than silence. 3 nearby systems had also gone dark in the past cycle. The Ravagers were not just attacking New Valoria. They were cleansing this entire sector of space. Veltar made the hardest decision of his life. He activated the deep space emergency beacon and began transmitting on frequencies that were forbidden by galactic law. He sent their plea into the quarantine zone around Sol 3, the legendary home of the Deathworlders. Every civilized species knew the stories, a world so hostile that it bred creatures capable of surviving anything, beings so dangerous that the galaxy had agreed to leave them alone in their corner of space. The tales spoke of monsters that walked upright and used tools, creatures that had evolved from predators so successful that they dominated their entire world. Their planet was a nightmare of natural disasters, deadly weather, and poisonous gases. Yet somehow these beings had not just survived, but thrived in conditions that would kill most galactic species in minutes. Some said the Deathworlders had tried to expand beyond their system centuries ago, but had been contained by a coalition of peaceful species. Others claimed they had quarantined themselves after realizing how dangerous they were to civilized life. The truth was lost in legend and fear. All that remained were warnings passed down through generations. Never approach Sol 3, never contact the creatures that lived there, and pray they never decided to leave their prison of space. But desperate times called for desperate measures. As another wave of Ravager ships entered the atmosphere and began hunting fleeing Valorians through the crystal forests, Veltar sent his final message toward the edge of known space. He spoke of his people's love for art and music and knowledge. He described the beauty they had created on this distant world. And he begged the Deathworlders to remember that not all species in the galaxy were threats to be eliminated. The response came faster than anyone expected. A simple message in a language that made no linguistic sense, but somehow conveyed meaning directly to the mind. Message received. Response incoming. Prepare for contact. Veltar stared at the communication display in shock. The transmission had originated from the Sol system but had arrived almost instantly across impossible distances. How had the Deathworlders managed to communicate faster than light itself? What kind of technology did they possess in their quarantined corner of space? More disturbing was the content of the message. The Deathworlders had not promised rescue or evacuation. They had not offered sanctuary or medical aid. They had simply stated that they were coming. The implications chilled Veltar to his crystalline core. These creatures were not sending help. They were sending themselves. the orbital bombardment, intensified as more Ravager ships joined the attack. The colony's beautiful gardens burned under streams of plasma fire. Ancient monuments built over generations crumbled into dust. Children cried in the shelters as their parents tried to comfort them with songs that were drowned out by the sound of destruction. Veltar watched his life's work disappear in clouds of smoke and flame. New Valoria had been his dream since childhood, a place where Valorians could explore art and science without the restrictions of the home worlds, a colony where young minds could pursue knowledge for its own sake. Now that dream was ending in fire and death at the hands of creatures that saw beauty as weakness. The Ravager ground forces landed near the main settlement as the bombardment shifted to the outer regions. Veltar could see them through the security cameras, massive beings covered in natural armor and carrying weapons that seemed to be fused to their bodies. They moved through the crystal streets like living tanks, smashing everything in their path. Some carried captured Valorians who screamed in harmonics, too painful for the communication system to process. Reports came in from all sectors of the colony. The hydroponics bays were burning. The cultural center had been reduced to rubble. The children's learning gardens were being used as target practice by Ravager warriors who found sport in destruction. In a matter of hours, 3 generations of Valorian achievement would be nothing but memory. Then something appeared on the long-range sensors that made no sense. A single ship was approaching from the direction of the Sol system. It was small, by galactic standards, roughly the size of a Valorian research vessel. The hull configuration was strange, with smooth curves and angles that seemed designed for purposes Veltar could not understand. Most puzzling of all, it was moving at speeds that should have been impossible for anything larger than a fighter craft. The ship's approach vector was equally bizarre. Instead of the cautious trajectory any sane captain would take when approaching a war zone, the vessel was heading straight for the center of the Ravager fleet. It showed no signs of slowing down or attempting to avoid contact. If anything, it seemed to be accelerating toward the largest concentration of enemy ships. Veltar tried to warn the approaching vessel, but received only static in response. Either the ship's communication system was damaged, or its crew was ignoring all attempts at contact. As the mysterious craft entered the outer edge of the Ravager formation, Veltar prepared to witness the destruction of his people's only hope. The last thing he expected was for the Ravagers to start exploding. Captain Do-hyun studied the tactical display as the Indomitable approached the edge of Valorian space. The ship's sensors painted a clear picture of the situation ahead. 17 Ravager patrol vessels formed a loose perimeter around the system, while the main fleet conducted orbital bombardment of the 4th planet. Standard Predator pack behavior according to the xenobiology files. His crew moved with quiet efficiency around the bridge. Weapons specialist Boram ran final checks on the ship's defensive systems, while pilot Tae-min calculated approach vectors that would keep them alive long enough to assess the situation. Engineer Jin Woo monitored the ship's experimental systems, with the focused attention of someone who knew that one miscalculation could turn them all into scattered atoms. The first contact came sooner than expected. 3 Ravager destroyers broke formation and moved to intercept the approaching human vessel. Their transmission was brief and brutal. Surrender immediately or be destroyed. No negotiations, no mercy. Standard operating procedure for a species that had conquered half the galaxy through fear and overwhelming force. Do-hyun activated the ship's response protocols. Boram's fingers danced across weapon controls that had been designed for situations exactly like this. The Indomitable was not a warship by human standards, but it had been built to survive contact with hostile alien species. Every system on board reflected centuries of human experience in making friends with things that wanted to kill them. The Ravager ships opened fire first. Plasma streams and kinetic projectiles filled the space between the vessels as the aliens attempted to disable what they assumed was a simple exploration craft. Their weapons were powerful and accurate, designed to overwhelm enemy shields through raw destructive force. Against most galactic species, such tactics were devastatingly effective. The Ravagers had never fought humans before. Tae-min threw the Indomitable into a spiral pattern that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The ship twisted through space like a living thing, using gravitational fields and momentum in ways that made no sense to observers who had evolved on worlds with simple orbital mechanics. What looked like random evasion to the Ravagers was actually a carefully calculated dance designed to position the human ship for maximum advantage. Boram waited until the enemy vessels had committed to their attack runs before responding. The Indomitable's weapons were not the massive energy cannons favored by most galactic powers. Instead, the ship fired small projectiles that moved too fast for alien sensors to track properly. Each projectile contained enough kinetic energy to punch through starship armor like tissue paper. The first Ravager destroyer died before its crew realized they were under attack. The second managed to raise its shields just in time to watch them collapse under the impact of weapons that operated on principles alien to their understanding. The third ship attempted to retreat, but found itself cut off by a human vessel that moved like a predator that had been hunting in vacuum for millions of years. Communications Officer Young Su established contact with the Valorian colony, while Boram finished eliminating the patrol ships. The transmission quality was poor due to interference from the ongoing bombardment, but the message was clear enough. Beautiful crystalline beings who communicated through musical harmonies were begging for help in voices that conveyed emotions no human language could express. Du-Hyun felt something stir in his chest as he listened to the Valorian pleas. These people had created art and music and poetry, while his species had been learning to kill things with sharp sticks. They had built a peaceful civilization dedicated to knowledge and beauty, while humans had been perfecting the art of war. Now they were dying because they had never learned that sometimes violence was the only answer to violence. The captain opened a communication channel to the Valorian colony administrator. He introduced himself in calm, professional tones that gave no hint of the destruction his ship had just inflicted on the Ravager patrol. He requested tactical information about enemy fleet composition, weapons capabilities, and defensive positions. The questions seemed to confuse the aliens who had expected requests for evacuation routes or diplomatic solutions. Administrator Veltar, Moonweaver, responded with a mixture of hope and terror that Young Su found difficult to translate. The Valorian leader described his people's peaceful nature and their complete lack of military experience. He offered to provide any information the humans required, but seemed unable to understand why they wanted to know about Ravager weapons rather than safe passage out of the system. Medic Yunji monitored the conversation while preparing the ship's medical bay for possible casualties. She had studied alien physiology during her training, but the Valorians represented her first opportunity to treat a non-human species under combat conditions. Their crystalline biology presented unique challenges that would require creative solutions, if any of them survived the coming battle. Engineer Jin Wu analyzed the sensor data streaming in from the colony's remaining observation satellites. Ravager technology was impressive by galactic standards, but showed clear signs of evolutionary stagnation. Their ships were powerful but predictable, designed by a species that had never faced serious resistance. Against opponents who always surrendered or fled, there had been no pressure to innovate or adapt. Humans had taken a different evolutionary path. Every piece of technology on the Indomitable reflected the constant struggle of a species that had learned to survive on a world that actively tried to kill them. Their weapons were designed to work against enemies who fought back. Their engines were built to operate in conditions that would destroy most galactic vessels. Their crew had been trained to think tactically because anything less meant extinction. The main Ravager fleet noticed the destruction of their patrol ships and began repositioning to meet the new threat. Du-Hyun counted over 200 vessels of various classes, from small fighters to massive battlecruisers. Any sane captain would have retreated to call for reinforcements. Most galactic powers would have needed an entire battle fleet to engage. Such a force. Du-Hyun activated the ship's combat protocols and began planning his attack. Taemin plotted an approach course that would take them through the asteroid field on the edge of the system. The rocky debris would provide cover and concealment while forcing the larger Ravager ships to break formation. It was exactly the kind of three-dimensional tactical thinking that had allowed humans to dominate aerial combat on Earth for centuries. Boram began calculating firing solutions for targets that were still hours away. Her weapons required precise timing and positioning to achieve maximum effect. Unlike the brute force approach favored by most species, human tactics relied on speed, accuracy, and the element of surprise. One shot, one kill, no second chances. No margin for error. The Valorians watched in growing amazement as the single human ship prepared to engage a fleet that outnumbered it by hundreds to one. They had never encountered a species that viewed impossible odds as merely another tactical problem to solve. Their own people would have surrendered or attempted to negotiate under such circumstances. Young Su established a secure communication link with Earth Command and transmitted a brief situation report. The response came back, within minutes, encoded in military protocols that predated first contact with alien species. The message was simple and direct. Weapons free, all targets authorized. Protect the civilians. Du Hyun smiled as he read the orders. Earth had not sent a rescue ship or a diplomatic mission. They had sent hunters to deal with a predator problem. The distinction would become clear soon enough to everyone involved. The Indomitable accelerated toward the heart of the Ravager fleet as its crew prepared for the kind of fight that had defined human existence since the first ape picked up a sharp stick and decided that being prey was no longer acceptable. War Prime Kethavar commanded the Ravager fleet from the bridge of his flagship Bone Crusher with the confidence of a predator who had never known defeat. His species had conquered over 300 worlds through superior firepower and ruthless tactics. No civilized race had ever offered meaningful resistance to Ravager expansion. This human vessel approaching his fleet would be just another quick victory to add to his record. The War Primes studied the tactical displays with growing amusement. A single small ship was accelerating directly toward the center of his formation. Either its crew was insane or they possessed weapons technology far beyond anything in the galactic database. Kethavar suspected the former. Desperation often drove lesser species to attempt futile gestures of defiance before accepting their inevitable fate. He ordered his forward squadrons to encircle and disable the approaching vessel. Standard capture protocols for unknown technology. The ship's crew would provide useful intelligence about human capabilities before being sold into slavery. Their vessel would be torn apart by Ravager scientists to determine if any systems were worth stealing. Everything would proceed according to established patterns. The first indication that something was wrong came when the human ship began moving in impossible patterns. Captain Do Hyun had activated Deathworlder Protocol Omega, a combat doctrine developed specifically for engagements against overwhelming odds. The Indomitable twisted through three-dimensional space like a living creature, using gravitational fields and momentum in ways that violated everything the Ravagers understood about space combat. Taemin piloted the ship through the asteroid field with casual skill that made the Valorian observers gasp in terror. He threaded the vessel between chunks of rock moving at orbital velocities while maintaining combat speed and keeping weapons locked on target. To the human pilot, this was simply another day at the office. To aliens who had evolved on stable worlds with predictable physics, it was incomprehensible madness. The Ravager squadrons found themselves unable to maintain formation as they tried to follow the human ship through the debris field. Their larger vessels were forced to break apart and navigate individually, destroying their tactical advantage and exposing them to concentrated fire. War Prime Kethavar watched his carefully planned formation dissolve into chaos as a single enemy vessel led his entire fleet into a three-dimensional maze of death. Bo-Rom began her systematic destruction of the Ravager forces with the cold precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. Each shot was calculated to achieve maximum damage with minimum ammunition expenditure. The Indomitable's weapons fired projectiles that moved too fast for alien point defense systems to intercept. Ships that had dominated battlefields across the galaxy found themselves helpless against technology they could not understand or counter. The first Ravager battlecruiser died when a human kinetic penetrator punched through its main reactor housing. The explosion took out 3 escort vessels that had been flying in close formation. The second cruiser managed to return fire but found its plasma streams striking empty space as the human ship danced away from targeting solutions that should have been impossible to escape. Engineer Jin Woo monitored the ship's experimental systems while analyzing Ravager technology through passive sensors. The alien vessels were powerful but predictable, designed by engineers who had never faced opponents capable of fighting back effectively. Their weapons were built for overwhelming force rather than precision. Their hulls were armored against energy weapons but vulnerable to kinetic strikes. Most importantly, their crews had never developed the tactical flexibility needed to adapt to unexpected situations. War Prime Kethvar realized he was not fighting a ship, but a predator that had evolved in an environment where anything less than perfection meant extinction. Every human action was calculated to turn Ravager strengths into weaknesses. When his ships tried to use their superior numbers, the human vessel led them into positions where they blocked each other's fire. When they attempted to surround their target, it used their own formation against them to create killing fields. The battle became a masterclass in three-dimensional tactics, as Captain Do-hyun demonstrated why humans were the apex predators of their home system. The Indomitable used the planet's gravity well not as an obstacle, but as a weapon, slingshotting around the world at velocities that stressed the ship's hull to its breaking point. Each pass through the formation left more Ravager vessels burning in space. Young Su and Jin Woo worked together to hack into Ravager communication networks, not simply to gather intelligence, but to plant false orders that turned the alien fleet against itself. Computer viruses designed by human programmers began spreading through Ravager systems like digital cancer, causing weapons to misfire and navigation computers to provide incorrect data. The Valorians watched from their dying colony as impossible. Events unfolded in the space above their world. A single human ship was systematically dismantling a fleet that had terrorized dozens of star systems. The crystalline beings had no frame of reference for such tactical brilliance. Their own military experience consisted of ceremonial guards and crowd control. They had never imagined that warfare could be conducted with such precision and creativity. Medic Yoon-ji continued treating wounded colonists even as the space battle raged overhead. Her calm professionalism in the face of ongoing violence amazed the Valorians, who had never encountered a being capable of remaining focused while surrounded by destruction. She worked with steady hands and clear thinking, demonstrating another aspect of human nature that separated them from most galactic species. War Prime Kethvar sent increasingly desperate orders to his remaining ships as his formation continued to collapse. Nothing in his centuries of military experience had prepared him for opponents who fought like they enjoyed being outnumbered. The humans showed no fear, no hesitation, no mercy. They moved through his fleet like hunters, culling a herd of prey animals. The turning point came when Captain Do-hyun revealed the true nature of his vessel. What had appeared to be a simple exploration ship began deploying weapons systems that had been hidden within its hull. The Indomitable was not a rescue vessel or a diplomatic courier. It was a prototype stealth warship designed to operate alone, behind enemy lines against impossible odds. Bo-Ram activated the ship's primary armament for the first time since leaving Earth. The weapon had no name in any galactic language because no other species had ever imagined such a thing. It fired projectiles that existed in a quantum superposition until they struck their targets, making them impossible to defend against using conventional methods. The technology was theoretical even by human standards, but war had always been humanity's greatest teacher. 3. Ravager capital ships died in as many seconds as weapons that should not have existed tore through hulls that had been designed to withstand anything the galaxy could produce. War Prime. Kethvar watched his flagship's sister ships disappear in bursts of light that violated the laws of physics as he understood them. The remaining Ravager vessels began a fighting retreat toward the edge of the system. Their crews had finally realized what they were facing. These were not the peaceful explorers or desperate refugees they had encountered in previous conquests. These were apex predators from a world that had taught them to hunt things that hunted back. Kethvar activated his personal communication system and began transmitting on all frequencies. His message was simple and direct, a warning to every Ravager commander in the galaxy about the creatures that had emerged from the quarantine zone around Sol 3. Demons who fought like they had been to hell and back because they had been born there. As his flagship died around him, War Prime Kethvar realized that the age of easy conquest was ending. Somewhere in the darkness between the stars, the Deathworlders were hunting, and they were very, very good at it. The space around New Valoria had become a graveyard of twisted metal and cooling plasma. Dozens of Ravager vessels drifted as lifeless hulks, while others burned with fires that would continue for days in the vacuum. War Prime Kethvar stared at the tactical display from the bridge of his dying flagship and tried to understand what had gone wrong with what should have been a simple conquest. His species had perfected the art of warfare over millennia of expansion across the galaxy. They had developed tactics and weapons that could overwhelm any organized resistance. Their ships were stronger, their crews more experienced, their technology more advanced than anything most civilized species could produce. Yet a single vessel crewed by creatures from a quarantined world was systematically destroying his entire fleet. Captain Do-hyun monitored the battlefield from the bridge of the Indomitable, while his crew continued their methodical elimination of Ravager forces. The human ship moved through the debris field like a shark swimming through a school of fish, striking with surgical precision before disappearing into the maze of wrecked vessels and orbital debris. Each attack was perfectly timed and executed, demonstrating a level of tactical coordination that should have been impossible for such a small crew. Taemin had become a legend among the surviving Ravager pilots as he guided the Indomitable through maneuvers that defied understanding. The human pilot used every piece of matter in the local space as either cover or a weapon, turning the very environment into an extension of his ship. Asteroids became kinetic projectiles. Gravity wells became acceleration boosters. The planet's magnetic field became a navigation tool that allowed impossible course corrections. The Valorians watched from their shelters as their impossible saviors, continued to demonstrate why the galaxy feared the Deathworlders. These humans fought with a combination of technology and instinct that no other species could match. They moved like predators who had evolved in an environment where hesitation meant death and mercy was a luxury that led to extinction. Young Su had penetrated deep into the Ravager communication networks and was using their own systems against them. False orders spread through the alien fleet like a virus, causing ships to fire on their own allies and navigate into collision courses with friendly vessels. The human communication specialist was not simply disrupting enemy coordination, but actively turning their organization into a weapon against itself. War Prime Kethvar tried to rally his remaining commanders through direct communication channels, but even these had been compromised by human infiltration. Every order he gave was intercepted and modified by Young-Su before being transmitted to its intended recipients. Ships that were ordered to retreat instead received instructions to advance. Vessels commanded to regroup found themselves isolated and vulnerable to concentrated attack. Engineer Jin Woo analyzed the performance of captured Ravager technology, while maintaining the Indomitable's experimental systems. The alien equipment was impressive by galactic standards, but showed clear signs of technological stagnation. Their weapons were powerful, but inflexible, designed for overwhelming opponents, rather than adapting to changing battlefield conditions. Most critically, their defensive systems had never been tested against weapons that operated on principles unknown to galactic science. The battle had become a demonstration of human tactical doctrine that would be studied by military historians for generations. Captain Do-hyun was not simply destroying enemy ships, but systematically dismantling the entire conceptual framework that allowed the Ravager Empire to function. Every action was calculated to prove that overwhelming force was useless against superior tactics and technology. Bo-Ram continued her precise elimination of priority targets while analyzing alien defensive capabilities for future reference. The weapons specialist had identified critical weaknesses in Ravager ship design that could be exploited by human forces in future encounters. Their hulls were too rigid, their power systems too centralized, their crews too dependent on automated systems that could be compromised or disrupted. Medic Yoon-ji worked steadily in the colony's medical facilities while monitoring the space battle through passive sensors. Her presence among the wounded Valorians had become a source of hope and wonder as the crystalline beings observed a human maintaining perfect calm and competence while surrounded by violence and destruction. She represented another terrifying aspect of human nature, the ability to remain functional under conditions that would paralyze most galactic species. The Valorian colonists had begun to understand that their rescuers were not actually rescuing them. The humans had not come to evacuate civilians or negotiate a peaceful resolution. They had come to eliminate a threat through the systematic application of superior violence. The distinction was subtle but important to beings who had never conceived of warfare as anything other than a tragic failure of diplomacy. Administrator Veltar Moonweaver maintained communication with Captain Do-hyun throughout the engagement, providing tactical intelligence and damage assessments as requested. The human captain's questions revealed a mind that thought in terms of maximum destruction rather than minimum casualties. He wanted to know which Ravager ships carried the most advanced weapons, which vessels housed the senior commanders, and which targets would create the greatest psychological impact on enemy morale. War Prime Kethvar realized that he was not facing a military force but a hunting pack that had evolved to kill creatures much larger and more dangerous than themselves. The humans coordinated their actions with an instinctive understanding of pack tactics that allowed them to strike with overwhelming force at precisely the right moment. They moved like predators who had learned to hunt in 3 dimensions across interstellar distances. The tide of battle turned completely when the Indomitable revealed its final surprise. The ship that had appeared to be a simple exploration vessel began deploying previously hidden weapon systems that violated every known principle of galactic warfare. Energy weapons that fired projectiles existing in quantum superposition. Kinetic cannons that accelerated mass to relativistic velocities. Defensive shields that reflected incoming attacks back at their sources with amplified force. Young Su transmitted a final message to the surviving Ravager vessels on all frequencies simultaneously. The transmission was brief and delivered in perfect Ravager military language that should have been impossible for any human to know. The message contained detailed tactical assessments of Ravager weaknesses, precise casualty figures from the engagement, and coordinates for the locations of their hidden supply bases throughout the sector. The implications were terrifying for any Ravager commander intelligent enough to understand them. The humans had not simply defeated their fleet, but had done so while simultaneously gathering intelligence on their entire military infrastructure. This had not been a rescue mission or a defensive action. It had been a reconnaissance in force designed to test human capabilities against real enemies under combat conditions. Kethvar transmitted his final warning to the Ravager High Command as his flagship began breaking apart around him. The creatures from the quarantine zone were not the peaceful explorers or desperate refugees that other species had described. They were apex predators who had learned to hunt in the void between stars, and they were spreading beyond their original territory with weapons and tactics that no galactic power could match. The War Prime's last transmission spread throughout Ravager space and beyond, carrying word of humanity's emergence to every species in the galaxy. The message was simple and direct. The Deathworlders had broken containment, and they were hunting monsters with the skill and determination of creatures who had been born in hell itself. As the Bone Crusher died in fire and vacuum, War Prime Kethvar understood that his species had finally encountered something they could not conquer or intimidate. For the first time in Ravager history, they had become the prey. The silence that followed the destruction of the Ravager fleet was more profound than any sound the Valorians had ever experienced. Administrator Veltar Moonweaver stood among the ruins of his colony and watched as the last enemy vessels fled toward the edge of the system, their hulls scarred and their crews broken by an encounter with predators they had never imagined could exist. The Indomitable hung motionless in orbit above New Valoria like a patient hunter, watching wounded prey escape into the darkness. Captain Do Hyun made no attempt to pursue the fleeing Ravagers, though his ship could have easily overtaken and destroyed them. Instead, he opened a communication channel to the colony and requested permission to land a shuttle for face-to-face contact with the surviving Valorians. The crystalline beings who emerged from their shelters to greet the human landing party had expected to find warriors flushed with victory and eager to celebrate their triumph over impossible odds. Instead, they discovered quiet professionals who treated the systematic destruction of an entire enemy fleet as routine maintenance rather than an historic achievement. The humans checked their equipment, filed their reports, and prepared to leave with the calm efficiency of people who had simply completed another day's work. Captain Do Hyun met with Administrator Veltar in the ruins of the colony's main meeting hall. The human officer was smaller than the Valorians had expected, with none of the physical intimidation they associated with warriors. He spoke in soft, measured tones that conveyed competence rather than aggression. His questions focused on practical matters: casualty figures, infrastructure damage, and estimates for rebuilding timelines. The Valorian leader found himself struggling to comprehend the mindset of beings who could unleash such devastating violence and then immediately shift their attention to humanitarian concerns. Captain Do Hyun discussed medical supplies and construction materials with the same calm professionalism he had used to coordinate the destruction of 200 enemy warships. The dichotomy was both fascinating and terrifying to a species that viewed violence and compassion as mutually exclusive concepts. Medic Yunji established a field hospital in the colony's cultural center and began treating wounded Valorians with techniques that seemed almost magical to the crystalline beings. Her medical knowledge encompassed species she had never encountered before, allowing her to adapt human surgical procedures to alien physiology with intuitive skill. She worked without rest for 18 hours, saving lives that would have been lost without immediate intervention. The Valorians gradually began to understand that they were witnessing another aspect of human nature that separated them from most galactic species. These creatures could transition seamlessly from devastating combat to compassionate healing without any apparent psychological difficulty. They were equally competent at destroying enemies and saving lives, treating both activities as natural expressions of their fundamental nature. Engineer Jin Wu surveyed the colony's damaged infrastructure and began implementing repair procedures using techniques that seemed to violate the laws of physics. Human engineering approaches favored adaptability and resourcefulness over elegant solutions, allowing them to create functional systems from salvaged materials and improvised components. Within hours, critical systems that the Valorians had assumed were permanently destroyed were operating at full capacity. Administrator Veltar offered everything his people could provide in exchange for continued human protection. Advanced crystalline, technology that could revolutionize computing and communications, artistic treasures that represented centuries of Valorian cultural achievement, access to rare minerals that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. The humans politely declined all offers with explanations that made no sense to the desperate Valorian leader. Captain Do-hyun explained that his mission had not been a rescue operation, but a field test of human capabilities against real enemies, under combat conditions. The Indomitable represented average human technology operated by a standard exploration crew on routine patrol duty. If this was humanity's normal response to distress calls, the implications for galactic politics were staggering and terrifying. The Valorians realized they had made contact with a species that measured military effectiveness by completely different standards than the rest of the galaxy. What they had witnessed was not humanity's elite forces or their most advanced weapons. It was a single ship with a crew of 6 individuals conducting what humans considered a minor skirmish against outdated opponents using obsolete tactics. Young Su established communication links with the broader galactic community and began transmitting detailed reports of the engagement to Earth Command. His messages contained tactical assessments of Ravager capabilities, intelligence gathered from captured, databases, and recommendations for future human expansion into the local sector. The communications officer treated first contact with an alien species as a routine intelligence gathering opportunity. The true nature of humanity's emergence into galactic affairs became clear when Captain Do-hyun requested detailed information about Ravager military installations throughout the sector. He was not interested in defensive preparations or diplomatic solutions. He wanted to know where to find more enemies to test human weapons against. The Valorians began to understand that their saviors were not interested in protecting peaceful species from aggressive neighbors. They were interested in hunting predators. Pilot Taemin conducted reconnaissance flights throughout the system while mapping jump points and navigation hazards for future human operations. His casual competence in maneuvering through environments that would challenge most galactic pilots demonstrated another aspect of human superiority that had evolutionary, rather than technological origins. These beings had learned to think in 3 dimensions because their homeworld had taught them that flat thinking led to extinction. The final revelation came when Administrator Veltar asked Captain Do-hyun what humanity wanted in exchange for their intervention. The human officer's response chilled the Valorian leader to his crystalline core. Earth wanted nothing from the peaceful species of the galaxy except one thing: information about where to find more monsters, like the Ravagers. Humanity had not broken containment to establish trade relationships or form diplomatic alliances. They had emerged from their quarantine zone because they were bored with fighting each other and wanted to test their skills against worthy opponents. The galaxy's apex predators had finally found prey challenging enough to hold their interest. As the Indomitable prepared to depart New Valoria, Captain Do-hyun transmitted a message that would spread throughout known space within days. Humanity was officially announcing its presence to the galactic community with a simple declaration. Earth was open for business, and their business was hunting things that hunted others. The transmission included detailed specifications for human, military capabilities, tactical doctrine, and expansion plans that made it clear that the age of easy conquest was over. Any species that preyed on peaceful civilizations would now have to contend with hunters who had evolved specifically to kill apex predators. War Prime Kethavar's final warning had already begun spreading through Ravager space and beyond. Word of the creatures from Sol 3 who fought like demons and showed no mercy to those who terrorized the innocent. Stories of a single human ship that had destroyed an entire fleet without taking significant damage. Reports of weapons and tactics that operated on principles unknown to galactic science. The Valorians watched the Indomitable disappear into hyperspace and tried to process what they had witnessed. They had been saved by creatures more terrifying than their enemies, beings who viewed violence as a tool rather than an evil. Their peaceful civilization would survive, but the galaxy itself would never be the same. Somewhere in the darkness, between the stars, the Deathworlders were spreading beyond their original territory with weapons designed to kill things that had never imagined they could become prey. The monsters that had terrorized peaceful species for millennia were about to discover what it felt like to be hunted by creatures who were very, very good at it. The age of humanity had begun, and the galaxy would learn to fear the sound of human laughter in the void.